Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. I'm Ryan Kellogg, Professor and Deputy Dean for Academic Programs here at Harris. I am very excited to have National Climate Advisor Ali Zaidi here with us to share his thoughts on climate and energy policy tonight. This conversation is especially timely since we find ourselves right now in a remarkable time to be thinking about and working in energy and climate. On the climate front, the scope of damages from a changing climate are now clearer to us than they've ever been. Climate change is no longer some far-off abstract problem for the future. It is here now. In the US, damages from wildfires are at an all-time high, driven by intense heat and drought in the West. Europe last summer experienced an unprecedented drought so severe that the Rhine River actually dried up to the point that ships could no longer sail on it, even when unloaded. Pakistan suffered the opposite extreme of too much water with a catastrophic monsoon and flooding that killed over 1,000 people and displaced hundreds of thousands more. This is a humanitarian disaster that reminds us that the burden of climate change falls most severely on low-income communities and their vulnerable residents. At the same time, we've also been served a reminder over the past few months that the climate challenge is linked to a broader energy challenge of providing people and communities with energy services that are both low cost and reliable. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has spiked energy prices around the world, leading to widespread hardship, from high gas prices and pain at the pump, all the way to widespread insecurity about whether households will be able to keep themselves warm this coming winter. This is an energy security and affordability challenge that clarifies that we can't solve the climate problem in isolation. Climate solutions need to be paired with policies that ensure low cost and reliable energy to the households, communities, and businesses that depend on it. This joint energy and climate challenge, it's a daunting one. It's easy to be pessimistic. But at the same time, there's cause for optimism. Last summer, the US passed for the very first time comprehensive federal legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. On top of that policy breakthrough, the Biden administration, states and municipalities, and international governments are taking their own steps to addressing the challenge. And I'm thrilled that Ali Zaidi is here to share his thoughts on many of these actions and on what's coming next. He'll be doing that in conversation with Katherine Baicker, the Emmett Dedman Professor and Dean of the Harris School. Kate is a leading scholar of health economics whose research has been widely published and has played prominently in debates about the reform of the US healthcare system. She serves on the Congressional Budget Office's panel of health advisors and has been a commissioner on the Medicare Payment Advisory Commission and a Senate-confirmed member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. Please welcome Dean Baicker.
Thank you, Ryan, and I'm thrilled to see all of you here today. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors for this event, EPIC, the Energy Policy Institute at Chicago, who helped us organize this and who brings together so many important climate conversations here on campus, the Illinois Environmental Council, which also helped bring the event together and is a wonderful partner for us in thinking about things at the federal, state, and local level, and John Oxtoby, who is a former classmate and White House colleague of tonight's guest and was instrumental in bringing this event together. He also teaches a very popular ESG class here at Harris. And for those of you who are interested in continuing the conversation or alumni who might be here, he's going to host a roundtable in room 7 after the event. So please stick around for that if you'd like to dig deeper. But mostly, it's my honor to welcome Ali Zaidi here to the Keller Center. He's assistant to President Biden and national climate advisor, and he served in leadership positions for climate change and energy policy during the Obama-Biden administration, as well as New York's chairman of climate policy and finance and deputy secretary for energy and the environment. So he has seen these policy questions from multiple perspectives, and he is a driving force in the most significant climate policy that we've seen in generations. So I am delighted to welcome him here. I'm really looking forward to asking him some questions. You should all prepare your questions as well, because there'll be time for Q&A at the end. So please join me in welcoming him to the stage.
All right. Thank you, Dean. Thank you for the welcome. Thank you to all of you for being here for what I think is an important conversation in a critical moment that will really define us for decades to come. So, y'all are pretty young, but when I was born, the year I was born was the first year that the planet stayed at 350 parts per million atmospheric concentration of CO2. And that's significant because we knew then that 350 parts per million atmospheric concentration of CO2 was the last safe level for atmospheric concentration of CO2. And in the decades since, we've seen that creep up. 360, 370, 380, 390, breaking through 400. And for a really long time, we've failed to take decisive action to combat this trend. And, you listen to the scientific community, the United Nations panel of climate scientists, the IPCC, they call it a code red for humanity. And you don't have to go to the top of Mount Mauna Loa, where they measure the atmospheric concentration of CO2. You don't have to flip open the IPCC's latest report to know that the code red is real. It's in our communities, in the surging seas, in the scorching fires, in the droughts that have ravaged fields, lives destroyed, and in economic terms, supply chains and value disrupted, taken down. So, it's really easy with this backdrop to think about code red as a stop sign, as something that freezes us in our tracks. There's a lot that's going on that may make us feel despondent and hopeless, maybe even cynical about our ability to tackle a problem of this magnitude. And I hope if you take nothing else away tonight, zero, that you will take away a sense of validation that showing up, taking on this challenge, you're making a difference. We went into Paris, the climate agreement in 2015. The world was on a trajectory of 5 to 6 degrees, maybe more, of warming. At the beginning of the Biden administration, we were on a course for over 3 degrees of warming. Coming out of the last conference of the United Nations in Glasgow, we now can look at maybe something below 2 degrees. But for that to materialize, we have to deliver. And that's the second big thing I hope you take away. Not only that we can bend the curve, but that this is the decisive decade to do that work. And when I say decisive, I don't mean think about it. I don't mean study. I don't mean analyze. I mean steel in the ground. Let's deliver the visible, tangible difference that people know we need. For folks here who will be in public policy positions, it means making the decision. It means casting the vote. For some of you who will go into the private sector, it means green-lighting the capital project, actually putting money and risk at stake to do the hard things. And then the third thing, and I know I've already said, take away hopefulness, take away a sense that we are in a decisive decade. Third thing, that I hope you'll take away, and I'll leave you with that, and we'll get into the conversation, is that this isn't just an opportunity to take on an environmental challenge. This is an opportunity to advance the cause of justice in this country and around the world. The dean talked about Pakistan. For me, that's pretty personal. I was born there. I close my eyes and probably imagine what it looks like for a third of the country to be flooded. This challenge accrues to those least equipped to adapt and respond to it. But if we take the action and we do it the right way, it can actually lift up people who have been looked over and left behind. It can invigorate an economy that is more just. So let this be the moment where we all recognize how powerful we are to impact change. Huge planetary scale problem, we're making a difference. People showed up, they put President Biden in office. We passed a bill, a gigaton of emissions potential, embedded in that statute, $370 billion. We made a difference. We got to do that quickly. We got to do that in this decade. And we got to do that with a sense of boundless aspiration, that we won't just tackle climate, we won't just make the environment more resilient and strong, but that society itself will be better for it. So, really grateful to be with you today and eager to dig into the conversation.
Well, you've given us so much to dig into with that introduction. I'm glad you led with hope, because when one looks out at the world, there are lots of causes for grave concern, and we're seeing effects of climate change in so many different ways, and they're disproportionately impacting populations who are least able to weather those challenges. So I want to get into the distributional implications, but before I do, I'd love for you to give us what you think are the most important aspects of the Inflation Reduction Act for actually affecting that global change, because it is the most resources that we've deployed to address climate change. It's a really significant piece of legislation. What are the key components? Set the stage for us.
Great. So I'd like to talk actually about both of the bills that we passed. And, you know, before we passed this big Inflation Reduction Act bill this past summer, last year we passed the bipartisan infrastructure law. And in our office, we joke, Bill and Ira, the couple that will save the planet. But Bill, so let's start with Bill. Bill includes the largest investment in the country's history into resilience. So we talked about resilience and adaptation. It's a place where we've really neglected, I think, to put professionalization and put effort. And the reality is, even if we succeed at our climate goals, right, 1.5 degrees, temperature will continue to rise for decades to come. It will not stabilize right away, just by the nature of the challenge that we have in front of us. So the effects that we're seeing are not going to get less bad overnight. So resilience and adaptation, absolutely critical. The second big component of the bipartisan infrastructure law was a $50 billion, largest ever investment in our grid. So one of the, I think, things people need to start to metabolize as an intuition is how central the power sector becomes to decarbonizing our economy. We think of the power sector as providing the energy for our buildings, some of our processes, but then we rely on things like gasoline, natural gas, and other fuel sources for other segments of our economy. As we think about how we decarbonize going forward, one of the things we've realized is the power sector itself is going to expand into the other sectors, right? So transportation, you're going to plug in. Well, the grid's got to get a lot bigger if it's going to help facilitate transportation. Industrial sector, at least for lower levels of heat, you got to plug in. That's going to require a lot of electrons. So the grid expansion, absolutely critical. Then we go to IRA. In IRA, we've got at the core of it $270 billion of investment through the tax code. Now, Kate knows this, but not everybody does. The way we get to $270 billion is these brilliant people at the Joint Committee for Tax and the Congressional Budget Office come together and they come up with estimates. So that is an estimate, but the reality is, at the heart of the estimate is what people think will happen when we incent essentially 30% of the cost to deploy solar and wind. We would provide that through tax code. Similar significant investment in transportation, in the industrial sector, into manufacturing itself, very big deal. So massive investment through the tax code. In addition to that, really the first of its kind investment in nature-based solutions, in forestry and agriculture, helping protect those old growth trees that breathe in all of the CO2 on our behalf, but also helping expand climate-smart agriculture, which is, I think, a really potent tool in the threat we're facing down. In addition to that, one of the things I'm the most proud of is a focus on environmental justice. So in the infrastructure law, it's the largest investment in remediating things like Superfund and brownfield sites, fixing up our water systems. But what the Inflation Reduction Act does is actually create this $27 billion, what the bill calls the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. But what that will do is help capitalize state and local green banks that can help finance clean energy projects in disadvantaged communities all across the country. We know it takes a little bit more elbow grease, a little bit more work, and maybe a little fewer returns to deploy in these places. We need to be a partner in doing that. So you've got Bill with an investment in the poles and the wires, in the charging stations, and then you've got IRA creating the demand for that by supporting generation of renewable assets, new fuel sources, and also an emphasis on environmental justice.
So you've highlighted the things that we need to deliver on through Bill and IRA, but you've also pointed to the importance of local infrastructure and partnership with the private sector. What do you think needs to happen with state and local governments and with the private sector with a focus on ESG to support the goals that Bill and IRA envision?
So look, the state and local governments are going to be the absolute front lines of making this happen, right? We can talk about solar and wind all we want, but at the end of the day, it's got to show up and the steel's got to go in the ground somewhere. And for that to happen, a state, local government have to team up and help permit that project, make sure it actually gets done. So one of the, I think, big things that we're going to have to work on is building that capacity at state and local government. And that starts with human capital. I mean, we don't even have literally the number of people that we need to be reviewing these projects and moving them forward. Before federal government, worked at the state level in New York, which is a large and sophisticated state. But that state, even with all the resources that it has, is having trouble working through all of the projects with their complexity and making sure they actually get done. So that's one way I think state and local governments play. Second way is there's a lot of this work that just doesn't happen at the federal level. That's not where the public policy gets developed. So the building sector. Federal government actually has a very light touch role in the building sector. Most building code work happens at the local level, maybe at the state level. And there are some states where they don't have building codes, which is a whole nother discussion. But one of the things that we're going to need to do is have that policy development move a lot more quickly. And I think we've seen that We were just meeting earlier today with the city of Chicago, where they're looking at not only building codes and standards for new buildings, but also thinking through how they can accelerate retrofit of existing ones. Now, the way the federal government plays in that is by having supportive investment strategies, providing technical assistance, and we're going to do that. I think the private sector piece is really important one. We have moved past the time when concessionary capital is going to be sufficient for the kind of transformation that we need. Just to put that very plainly, charity ain't gonna cut it, right? And that's why the Inflation Reduction Act is so important, because it makes the economics of investing in American clean energy irresistible, I think, for the private sector. We've really turned America into a magnet for private investment. And I think what's important is that, a lot of the ESG discourse has been a discourse around disclosure. And I think if the ESG discourse is going to meet the moment, we need to go from a discourse around disclosure to a discourse around decisions and delivery, right? Boards are going to be judged by their ability to substantiate how in this decade they are physically moving their companies in the direction of tackling the climate crisis. So I think there's innovation that needs to happen at the state and local level to build that capacity, to accelerate that policy making, and there's innovation that needs to happen in the private sector to build that capacity and accelerate decision making and actually allocate capital effectively against the challenge that we face down.
So you've highlighted the importance of meeting the moment rather than just disclosure and verbiage coming from the private sector. You've also talked about the human capital that's necessary to complement the infrastructure capital. How do you see this evolution of the energy sector affecting the U.S. workforce? How do you envision us transitioning to what that new economy looks like? And how should we be thinking about educating that next generation to be ready for it?
So one thing that, really bugs me is for the longest time, and this is the fault of, I think, the climate movement, we talked about these green jobs as if they're jobs on another planet. And so you're talking to folks and you say, hey, well, do you want a green job? And their reaction is basically, no, man, I want a real job. And I think what's been a real success for us, in part in pushing the legislative efforts that we have, is that we centered on jobs people already know how to do. So members of the IBEW, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, they're electricians. They know how to rewire America so that the transportation sector can run on electricity. And so they're building the charging stations. The building trades folks, they know how to do construction. And whether they're constructing the next coal plant or they're constructing the next wind farm, we are relying on a lot of the same tools, right? The welding, a lot of the same activities. And so we have an opportunity to aim their focus on this space. The United Auto Workers, who've helped build the middle class in this region and in the Great Lakes, they know how to make cars. And it's not a far stretch for them to go from making compressors for an internal combustion engine to going and making compressors for an electric vehicle, to shift from transmission to e-axles. And that's what they want to do. So I think one big thing that we need to do is actually focus on the skills people already have. And by the way, the collective bargaining agreements that have allowed them to leverage those skills into jobs that pay a decent wage and provide good benefits, and retain that as we go into the clean energy economy. I think the second thing that's so important, we often talk about, well, this thing went away, so why don't you drive 100 miles and go take this job somewhere else? We've got a transition plan for you. People don't want to drive 100 miles. They don't want to learn a new trade. And the reality is we don't need them to. So one thing we built into the tax code is if you deploy in a energy community, a place that got hit because of the energy transition, or a disadvantaged community, we will give you a 10% bonus on your tax credit. So we're putting our money where our mouth is, which is, I think, got to be the way we deliver in this moment.
So that's some really helpful connection from the federal government down to the state, to the private sector. Let's go in the other direction and think about the global landscape. You highlighted some of the global interconnectedness and context in your opening remarks. The US produces a small and shrinking share of the CO2 that goes into the atmosphere. How do you see the IRA affecting the US's position globally, and what do you think needs to happen in the rest of the world to achieve less than a 2-degree climate warming over the next period?
Well, one of the big things I think is going to be a shift by all of the major economies in the right direction. And, in the places where we have come down the cost curve, in the power sector in particular, so solar, wind now regularly outcompete their fossil competitors, not just here in the United States, but elsewhere. That investment in innovation is a benefit to the world as we move to a more sustainable future. I think one of the things the United States has to do is help be on the frontier of driving that cost reduction in the other sectors as well. So we've got to make heavy-duty zero-emission vehicles cheaper in the United States, because that's going to help in mega cities all around the world, whether they're in the global south or the global north. We've got to help decarbonize construction materials like cement and steel and asphalt and flat glass. If cement, by the way, were a country, it would account for 8% of global emissions. 8% of global emissions, just cement. So if we can get after that challenge, and we are, right? We're investing in driving down emissions from cement, that will accrue and be beneficial to everybody. And to your point about, who's got the most emissions and who's shrinking what, the reality is we have a lot of historic emissions. And we also have places like the University of Chicago. And so I think it's on us to do the most that we can in a way that's going to be mutually beneficial for everybody. And, one of the hallmarks of the Biden approach to climate is that we are going to make clean energy here in America. Made in America is a big part of how we're pursuing climate action. And I think, you can misconstrue that in a bunch of different ways. The way I think about it is we are leading by example. We're not just saying, hey, if you make some batteries, send them our way, and we'll maybe think about putting them out there. We are saying we are going all in, we're gonna make it here in America, and we're gonna ship it around the world, and we're gonna make it cheaper for everybody, so this stuff outcompetes the dirty stuff. I think that's what leadership looks like. And I think that's why, for the first time in a while, it doesn't feel like America's just back at the table on climate. It feels like we're here to stay and we're ready to lead.
So then what are your hopes for the next climate change conference in 2023?
Oh man. I think one thing we've got to do collectively as a global community is really elevate our sights on resilience and adaptation. I think we need to bring in the sort of inventiveness and innovation that we've seen in climate mitigation, the efforts to take the CO2 down, and apply that to responding to the next hurricane, responding to the next drought, and also in getting more resilient in the face of those challenges. So I think that's one big area. The second is we've got to continue to make progress on the places where we know we can collaborate. So the president launched this thing called the Global Methane Pledge, getting the world to sign up to 30% reduction in global methane emissions. The cool thing about methane emissions, well, there are some bad things about methane emissions because they're 40 times more potent. The good thing about methane emissions is that they are a short-lived pollutant. So if we get our act together on methane, we actually can reduce some warming in a near-term way. We've got to get more countries signed up to that, and we've got to help support the diffusion of the methane reduction technologies that we're pioneering here in the United States. Same with hydrofluorocarbons, an incredibly potent greenhouse gas. So look, I think part of this is keeping us moving in the right direction. I think the biggest risk in this decisive decade is that we somehow stall out or shift our direction of travel. We can't do that. It's way too late. So I think that's what keeps me up, and I think we've got some real tailwinds here.
Well, I'm really glad you focused on adaptation and resilience because, as you noted, even in the best case scenario, things are not getting all better tomorrow. And we are seeing these consequences in fires and floods and a range of environmental challenges that are not felt uniformly. They're clearly borne disproportionately by populations that may have the fewest resources to weather them or adapt to them. That seems true within the US when you look at, who lives in more flood-prone areas and who has the least, who has the fewest resources to adapt to them. And it's true when you look between countries, when you look at, how populations in Pakistan are faring relative to higher income countries. How do you see using these resources and this technology in a way that reduces those disparities and particularly helps populations that are starting out at a disadvantage and bearing a disproportionate burden of the cost?
So multi-part response to that. I think first is we got to be clear-eyed about the fact that in certain instances we can't just ignore the past and just hope that we do it right for the next chapter. We got to really grapple with the reality that we inherit. So in the Inflation Reduction Act, we have $1.5 billion of funding to plant trees. And there's a reason for that. It's because in communities that were historically redlined, racist housing policy here in the United States, it is literally hotter today because there is more pavement and fewer trees. So we've got to go do repair work so that those communities are not absorbing more of the pain than everybody else. Second example, we know that for a lot of communities, the lower lying areas is where we built housing for lower income folks. And so when those floods surge in, they're the ones that get impacted. So as we implement the bipartisan infrastructure law, we've prioritized these environmental justice communities to be the front of the line as we build this resilience infrastructure for floods. Slightly different, but I think equally important, in both Bill and IRA, we were able to get funding for this initiative called Reconnecting Communities. For the longest time in the United States, we used transportation policy to split communities, to divide them. Now we have to get to work reconnecting them. This is really hard work. It's not going to happen overnight, but this is the kind of visible difference I was talking about, right? We've got to carry all of these values forward in this moment. So it's not enough that, although it's really good, that in the Inflation Reduction Act, the tax credits to deploy the clean energy technologies, if you want the full credit, you have to hire 10% of your hours from folks in apprenticeships. If you want the full credit, you got to deploy in disadvantaged, low-income communities. If you want the full credit, you probably need to partner with a nonprofit entity so you can get direct pay. If you want the full credit, you got to source your materials, 50% of it, from here in the United States. So we're embedding our values in a way that, like, you don't normally do in the tax code, into the tax code for the go forward. But the go forward doesn't get us off the hook on the look back and the repair work that we need to do. So we got to do it both. And we got to do it with a fierce sense of urgency.
Well, you've highlighted a lot of the politics, small p and big P, embedded in all of this decision-making, legislation, thinking about how to bring different constituencies along and bring lots of communities along. Can you tell us a little bit about the process that got you to this place, the underlying politics, and what you think the political economy of the implementation is going to look like for success?
Yeah, I mean, I think that as easy as it is to focus on the macroeconomic contribution of these laws, they will facilitate, I think, capital formation in this space in a way that we've not seen ever. Or the microeconomics, right? If you're building a solar farm today, it costs you $100 million now. 30 to 40 million bucks of that comes from the tax code. I think the political economy piece is absolutely critical. We would not be here if we had not brought people together in common cause and common purpose across the labor community and the labor movement, across Black and brown communities that had felt completely disconnected from this debate and discourse. If we had not connected the dots back to America's manufacturing and competitiveness, which, by the way, is growingly tied to our national security position. And so that political economy is what helped us make this proposal resilient enough that it made it across the line. We've got to invest in that coalition if we're going to be successful in the long run. One, that means that all of those folks that saw themselves in this actually see themselves in the implementation. Are those apprenticeships going to materialize? Are we going to be working with unions to make sure that the pipeline into those apprenticeships looks like America? Are people going to have prevailing wage and living wage jobs when they come out of those apprenticeships? Are we going to invest in the communities where jobs have gone away? Or are we going to go do it somewhere else? So I think it's on us. I liken it to Congress gave us the nails and the hammer and the plywood. We got to do the hard work of building a better America. That's work left to be done. And that's, I think, where the political economy comes from. And I think the most profound and perhaps hardest to choreograph aspect of the political economy is going to come from that feeling that is unleashed when people encounter the visible difference. There's a front page in the last month or so of a paper in Flagstaff, New Mexico, and it talked about the Navajo Nation taking in deliveries of the first few electric school buses funded by the bipartisan infrastructure law. And you just got to think about the kid who for the first time gets on that school bus. It's quiet. It's cleaner. They're young, but they can tell. And they just have this sense, my country cares about me. People went through all this trouble to pass a law, to implement it, to get this school bus to show up in front of my house because I belong in this country and people care about me. That's where the political economy is going to come from. And so that's why when I say decisive decade is got to be about delivery, it's not just because we need the steel in the ground for some emissions target. It's because that's going to be our ticket to be on the right side of the politics here as well.
So I want to leave plenty of time for questions from the audience. So get your questions ready. I'm just going to ask one more question, which is going back to where you started with the importance of engagement and hope. People have shown up because they care. What can individuals do? We have a lot of people who are starting careers in this area, who work with nonprofits, who volunteer in the community. What's the call to action for?
We got some really young people.
Get ready. Work starts now. What should people do?
Well, look, number one, a lot of folks ask me, okay, well, you are, the White House is now shifting to implementation on a lot of these bills, right? So for the bipartisan infrastructure law, last year, the president brought on board the former mayor of New Orleans, Mitch Landrieu. He is our coordinator behind the infrastructure law. Recently, with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, we hired John Podesta, who is a seasoned veteran of driving change and progress through bureaucracies to help us quarterback this effort. People and talent and structure on our end of the equation will be absolutely critical. On your end, the thing I would say is the single best friend of implementation is the push for greater ambition. Right? If people are saying, hey, okay, Illinois, you got some great goals, 2040, 2050. Can we do 2035? Can we do 2030? Okay, Biden, you said you were going to deliver this thing in the next 5 years. Now you passed this bill. Can we do it 4 years, in 4 years instead? Now that's a pain for me, but that's what I need. That is the push we all need because we all belong in the solution set. That's number one. I think number two is this is not an exercise for one discipline. And what we need is everyone in their own disciplines aligning to incorporate this consideration into the work that you do. So let's say you work on agriculture, right? One really significant thing that's happening in agriculture is the shift to precision agriculture. Technology, it helps improve yields, it helps reduce inputs, more cost effective. But one other impact of precision agriculture is there are fewer emissions. There's less tillage. If you're sensitive to the fact that we are in the decisive decade, you will prioritize the shift to precision agriculture in a way that maximizes climate benefits. Let's say you like to build roads and bridges. I don't totally know why, but let's say that that is like your thing. And you think, well, gee, what do I have to do with climate change? You know, I don't even really like bike lanes, so I don't have anything to do with it. Well, actually, you do. because you're probably going to end up buying a lot of cement and steel. Buy it 20% cleaner. Then 2 years later, buy it 30% cleaner. Send a massive demand signal to the marketplace and help us decarbonize what people have long called hard to decarbonize. So I think the second is, no matter what your discipline is, bring your talent and time to this fight. And then I think the third is just help us fight cynicism. You know, people, we're all pretty utilitarian folks. I'm talking to an economist. But so we always are like, okay, I passed this bill, I'm on to the next thing, I gotta get this thing built, I gotta get this next deal done, I gotta do this, I gotta do that. Take time to step back and celebrate the progress we've been able to make together. I think that will give us the fuel to keep going.
Well, on that optimistic note, let me turn to the audience. And there are some people floating around with mics, and I see questions here and in the front. Please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Hi, this is a great conversation. My name is Ibrahim Rashid. I'm a Harris alum, and I work professionally in investment consulting as the lead for ESG and impact investing, which means that I help institutional investors, pensions, endowments, think about allocating into like climate action and so on. This is a really pertinent conversation. I've been talking a lot about the Inflation Reduction Act at work, and I've had a lot of crickets. I have presented I presented to all of our investors totaling 400 billion in assets at a conference a few weeks ago about how the IRA creates this massive opportunity for climate action, and crickets. You know, there was really no uptake. I was like, guys, it's an opportunity, and no one was really cared. Or when the IRA was passed, I started getting bombarded by VC and private equity being like, look, our returns are now juiced by all these tax credits, 45Q for carbon capture. And I was like, great, like let's take these through committee, let's underwrite them. And a lot of the feedback that I got from my own team and the firm, they were like, oh, like, yes, there's a new tax credit and theoretically it might work, but what about opportunity zones? Everyone was excited about that and how it was going to make an impact and how it's going to be attractive. And then the market got flooded. So let's stay away from these tax credits for right now. So the challenge that I'm facing is, you know, there's a lot of momentum that the policy is generating, but those of us on the allocator side, my job is to help these allocators make these decisions. They're not moving, even though the IRA is gonna, you know, get us to 50% reductions by the end of this decade. So I guess, do you have any advice on 2 points, how to engage with institutional investors? Let's talk state treasurers, let's talk university endowments, pensions, health systems, assets under management ranging between 50 million to a couple billion, right? So different profiles. How do you get them to care about climate action? Because I'm struggling even when I talk about the IRA. And then the second piece, when we're underwriting these funds that are going to benefit from the IRA's tax provisions, like carbon capture and 45Q, how do I fight that cynicism against being like, oh, it's just going to be oversaturated and a waste of time, like other tax-friendly impact products like the Opportunity Fund from 2017. I'm a practitioner, and I very much appreciate your advice because I love the IRA, but I'm getting crickets when I'm fighting for it. Thank you.
That's great. Well, they may not seem like it, but institutional investors are people. And I think thing number one is you just got to meet people where they are, right? So maybe they don't want to have a conversation about climate investments or a new thesis for how they're going to allocate their capital. I think the one big thing they all have to recognize is every single entity is investing in a climate-constrained world now. And the question is, are you going to be on the right side of that or not? So if you are investing in an industrial process today, a greenfield facility that is incapable of being fueled by clean hydrogen, you're leaning into stranding an asset in the future and not the very distant future. So for them, understanding that the Inflation Reduction Act provides $3 a kilogram for clean hydrogen, and that within a few years, that probably puts the clean hydrogen at parity with dirty hydrogen, is about shoring up the resilience of whatever it is that they are interested in, right? You look at folks who are maybe focused not on large cap, but on medium or smaller sized enterprises, right? They're in the very large supply chain that fuels all these industries. Well, General Motors and Ford now have a demand signal out for cleaner steel and aluminum. If you're investing in a pig iron process as opposed to HBI, which is 50% cleaner, you're probably not going to be as competitive in the marketplace even in a few years. So I think, it's very hard sometimes to get people to adopt a new offensive strategy, right? When you say, hey, there's gold in them hills, let's go run up there. We've never been there before, but let's go get it. People are like, nah, man, I don't want to do that. But if it is a well-traversed place where they have gone, and what you are offering them is a way to understand that known business in a way that it can be adapted to the climate reality we live in, that might work. So I think it's always, whether it's institutional investors or families, we've got to meet people where they are, right? It's the same thing with electric vehicles, right? Sometimes we think we can talk about electric vehicles without recognizing that the car at the end of the driveway is the car at the end of the driveway. And until we help people think through what to do with the car at the end of the driveway, they're not going to go buy another car because they can't afford it. That's why one of the things I'm super proud of in the Inflation Reduction Act is a tax credit for used electric vehicles. For a lot of people, meeting them where they are is to recognize they're probably going to get their next car from the used car lot, not from a new car lot. So I think that's absolutely critical. I think on the, is this going to pan out? For technologies like carbon capture, that's a reasonable question. These are technologies without that many road miles, and they will require some risk. I think this will require real risk appetite in the equity. But for things like solar and wind and energy efficiency, I think the answer is, you want good returns or not? Because this is the place to go get them. And I think that's going to speak louder than anything else.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
So I see a hand here, and then some hands down here, and then one up at the top.
Hi. Oh, wow. This is very loud.
You're good.
I'm Lena. I'm a second-year MPP here. I've been actually dying to ask this, my arm, but so one of my biggest interests is the fashion industry. In another life, I probably would have gone into fashion. I do take pride into making my own clothes, and it would be a lie to say that I don't participate in fast fashion. But my concern is the fact that the fast fashion industry isn't regulated enough. The fashion industry in general is one of the biggest contributors to carbon emissions, to plastic waste in our waters, and the fact that labor is unethical. And I know New York just is currently considering passing a fashion sustainability act of sorts. What efforts are being made on a national level to regulate the footprint that major fast fashion brands like Shein, H&M, and so forth have in this country?
So you're absolutely right to put that out as a challenge, and in particular, I think the use of plastic-based materials, polyester, is now really proliferating and creating a real challenge. One of the ways we're looking at the challenge is by looking at the materials that go into the system, and thinking about whether we can push companies to to undertake alternatives analysis and look at the literal inputs that go in and reduce the environmental intensity of that. But I'm just, in the candor of this small room, I will acknowledge that this is a place where we've got real work to do. This is a very dispersed industry. It's not one that has been subject to clear standards or regulation. It's a globalized industry. And I think states and local governments are helping us feel out what the next step might be, and that the federal government needs to be a partner on it. But I will be one to acknowledge, to say, this is a place where we still have a ton of innovation that needs to happen to create the policy regime that we need.
So I think we have time for 2 more questions down here.
Hi, I'm Kate Champion, and I'm a researcher here. And you kind of started to touch on this in your last question, but I'm kind of curious, what do you see as the steps that you need to take in the executive branch and at the state and local level to really implement these policies? Like, getting the funding was sort of step 0, but we've seen many, many policies get funding and then sort of just die on the implementation. And in some ways, sometimes regulation is the thing that pushes us to a higher standard, but it also sometimes stymies us from making progress quickly. And so, like, how do you sort of balance those 2 needs of government?
Well, I think one thing that we have going for us is that in a lot of the instances, we're not talking about nascent industries. We're talking about people had appetite and interest in expanding solar, appetite and interest in expanding electric vehicles, but the economics didn't support the pace and scale at which those things were going to move. So just to take the power sector, for example, we today in America have about 60 million homes worth of clean electricity onto the grid. It's a lot more than most people would realize. And 1 out of 7 of those clean electrons got plugged in the first 2 years of the Biden administration, which I'd say is pretty good. But for us to get where we need to go about 3 times faster in terms of deployment. I think the advantage that we have is we've got an industry now that wants to do that work, and we've got workers who are trained up to do it, but there are real barriers in the way. Supply chain is a barrier, so we're investing in trying to shore up the supply chain. Permitting is a barrier. We're trying to advance legislation to shore up permitting in this space. So I think one thing that's maybe different than the thrust of your question is that we've got some inherent momentum, and we've got to add more mass and velocity, and we've got to take some of the friction away. In other instances, there is a lot of program design and policy design that needs to happen, and we're going to be starting really from a much lower baseline. So take the shift to heat pumps in the residential space. That's not something that's happening in a mass market way already, and so we're going to have to help train up the workers. We're going to have to help train up local governments in terms of what sort of permitting protocols need to take place. And that is just the hard work of government. And I think you're right to say, well, gee, are we going to succeed or not? Being in the decisive decade means we have to succeed. So now the question just becomes, are we going to put in the belts and suspenders to do that? And I think that's where state policy, local policy, standard setting, combined with the investments that we've unlocked, move us forward. And I think the auto industry is a great example where we've got auto standards, tailpipe emission standards. We've got investments in manufacturing. We've got investments in the battery supply chain. We've got consumer tax credit now. We've got an aftermarket used vehicle consumer credit. And then in places like Illinois, we've got state incentives and state regulatory initiatives complementing that. So when all of that harmonizes, which is what we're trying to do, then I think we do get where we need to go.
Thank you. I think we're almost out of time, but time for one last question. Mike here.
Hello. My name is Max. I'm an MBA student at Chicago Booth. My question surrounds offsets. Right now, offsets are predominantly a voluntary market, and there are a lot of companies making claims without real proof of additionality. And so my question for you would be, are offsets an effective policy lever moving forward? And how would you improve upon the systems from California and New England to create a more regulated market?
That could be a whole PhD. I think we live in a time when we cannot be casting any solution aside as having no role to play, whether it's a technology, we need the technologies all to play, whether it's market-based mechanisms, we need to attach rigor to them, we need to attach transparency to them, we need to avoid unintended consequences. But I think we know, for example, through the Air Resources Board and the protocols development around certain fuel approaches, for example, that there is a way to do some of this work smartly. And one of the things that we're seeing that's actually different than traditional offsets is corporate investment in just good stuff, right? So we've got corporates that are now saying, well, we would have offset this money into the voluntary market, but instead we're going to actually invest it in deploying clean energy at a community scale in a disadvantaged community. So I think there's going to be the development, a lot of these approaches. The thing I'll say that is so important is we're not going to make it there where we really need to go if all we're doing is just moving boxes around, right? Just to go back to the beginning, the decisive decade means that there must be steel that goes in the ground and a visible difference that's made. And I think there's importance and study that needs to go into mechanisms like offsets, but at the same time, companies have to be spending against the bottom line of actually transforming their emissions profile, and there's really no substitute for that. So is it a tool that could be useful if attached to rigor with transparency, accountability, and a stress test against unintended consequences? Absolutely. But we've also got to stay focused on the prize here, which is getting the emissions out of the system.
Well, on that note, please join me in thanking our guests for a really illuminating conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.